Some people don't raise their voice because they're waiting for the exact moment it matters. The receipt lay flat on the polished oak table, its white surface glowing softly under the warm restaurant lights, and Daniel Whitmore didn't even glance at it as he signed his name with a slow, deliberate stroke, the kind of signature that had closed billion-dollar deals and ended careers without a second thought. Then with a faint smirk, he added a tip. 1 cent. Just enough to be noticed, just enough to mean something. And he slid the check toward the edge of the table like it was nothing more than an afterthought. But it wasn't. Not to him, because this wasn't about money. It never was. It was about control, about watching how people reacted when they were pushed just slightly out of their comfort, just enough to reveal who they really were. And across the room, Emily Carter noticed it immediately, not because she was looking for it, but because she always noticed everything. The way the pen had paused for half a second longer than necessary. The way his eyes had lifted just briefly to catch her reaction, the subtle test hidden inside a simple gesture. She picked up the receipt without a word, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, as if the number written there held no weight at all. And for a moment, Daniel watched her, expecting something, a flicker of irritation, a forced smile, anything. But there was nothing, just quiet professionalism. Just a woman doing her job as if the world outside that table didn't exist, and that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Because anger was predictable, anger was easy, but silence left space, and space made him curious. Emily turned away, moving through the restaurant with practiced ease, her steps measured, her posture calm, as if the chaos of voices and clinking glasses simply flowed around her without ever touching her. And Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the table, then stopping, as he watched her again, more carefully this time, because something about her didn't fit the pattern. Most people adjusted themselves around him. They laughed too quickly, apologized too often, tried too hard to be invisible or too eager to be noticed. But she did neither. She existed in her own rhythm, untouched by his presence, and that made him lean forward again, just slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't planned on encountering that night. "Excuse me," he called out, not loudly, but with the kind of tone that expected immediate attention, and she returned, not rushed, not delayed, just exactly on time. "Was there something wrong with the service, sir?" she asked, her voice even, polite, but not submissive, never submissive, and Daniel tilted his head just a fraction, studying her. "You didn't react," he said, almost casually, as if commenting on the weather, and for the first time, her eyes met his directly, clear, steady, unafraid. "To what?" she asked, and there it was again, that absence of emotion he couldn't quite place, not indifference, not ignorance. Something else, something intentional. Daniel let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Most people would," he said, his tone carrying a quiet challenge now, an invitation, a test. But Emily simply nodded once, a small, controlled motion. "Most people do," she replied, and then she waited, not filling the silence, not trying to move the conversation forward, just letting it sit there between them, heavy and unresolved. And for the first time that evening, Daniel felt it. Not discomfort exactly, but a shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the ground beneath the interaction had tilted just slightly out of his control, and he realized, without fully understanding why, that this was no longer just a game. Daniel Whitmore did not look away this time. Not when she spoke. Not when the silence stretched longer than it should have. Because something in her tone had shifted the balance without raising it, without forcing it. And he was not used to that. Not used to conversations that did not bend around him like everything else in his world. He leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, no longer tapping. No longer signaling impatience, but measuring, recalculating. "You have been doing this a while," he said, his voice lower now, less performative, more deliberate. And Emily simply nodded once. "Long enough," she replied, her hands loosely folded in front of her, not defensive, not inviting, just present. And he watched her again, more carefully, noticing the details he had missed before, the way her posture never collapsed under pressure, the way her eyes did not dart away or seek approval, the way she stood as if she had nothing to prove to anyone in the room. And that realization sat strangely with him, because in his world, everyone was always proving something, always negotiating value, always reacting. But she was not reacting at all. She was choosing, and that difference, small as it seemed, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, not as a question of ego, but as a variable he needed to confirm, and Emily tilted her head just slightly, as if considering the weight of the question rather than the answer. "Yes," she said simply, no elaboration, no change in tone, and Daniel let out a breath through his nose, almost amused, almost frustrated. "And that does not mean anything to you?" he pressed, and for a brief second, something flickered in her expression, not fear, not admiration, something closer to quiet understanding. "It means something to a lot of people," she said, choosing her words with care. "But that does not mean it has to mean something to me." And the sentence landed with a weight that did not match its softness, the kind of weight that did not push, but settled, and Daniel felt it, felt the subtle shift again, like a door closing somewhere he had not realized was open. He straightened slightly, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal the crack in his composure. "You think this is a game?" he said, not accusing, not yet, but testing the edges of her response. And Emily's gaze did not move, did not soften, did not harden. It simply stayed, steady and clear. "No," she answered. "I think it is a habit." And that word, habit, lingered between them longer than anything else she had said, because it stripped away intention, stripped away power, reduced his carefully controlled actions to something automatic, something predictable, and Daniel felt it then, not anger, not fully, but something sharper, something closer to exposure, as if she had just named something he had never needed to question before. And for a moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade, the conversations, the clinking glasses, the quiet music, all of it pulling back until there was only the space between them. And in that space, Daniel realized something he did not like, something he could not immediately fix. He was no longer leading this interaction. He was following it, reacting to it, and that was not something he was used to losing. Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately, and that alone was unusual, because silence had always been his tool, not something used against him. He studied her as if recalculating the entire situation from the beginning, but the more he observed, the less predictable it became. Emily Carter stood there without shifting her weight, without adjusting her expression, without offering him anything to push against. And that absence of resistance felt stronger than any argument he had ever won. "A habit," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word in his own voice, and for the first time that evening, it did not sound like control, it sounded like recognition, and that unsettled him, not because she had challenged him directly, but because she had done something far more precise. She had named the pattern, and once a pattern is named, it can no longer hide. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting just above the table, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer casual, but engaged. "You think you understand me," he said, quieter now, not for the room, but for her, and Emily did not rush to answer. She let the moment breathe, let the weight of his words settle before she spoke. "No," she said, her voice still calm. "I think I have seen this before." And there it was again, that subtle shift, not personal, not emotional, but observational, as if he was not unique in this, as if he was simply another version of something she had already learned to recognize. And that thought pressed against something deeper inside him, something he had built his entire identity to avoid: being ordinary, being predictable, being just another man with money and influence who believed that control defined value. His jaw tightened, not visibly, but enough that he felt it, and he straightened in his seat, reclaiming the physical space even if the conversation had already moved beyond his reach. "And what exactly have you seen?" he asked, this time not masking the edge in his tone, not disguising the need to regain ground. And Emily's eyes held his without hesitation, without challenge, just clarity. "People who mistake reaction for respect," she said, each word placed carefully, evenly, without force. And yet the sentence landed heavier than anything he had said all night, because it reframed everything, every test, every subtle push, every moment he had believed he was in control. She was not accusing him. She was not attacking him. She was simply describing something he could not immediately deny, and that was what made it difficult. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table, grounding himself in something physical as the conversation shifted further away from his usual rules. He glanced around briefly, noticing for the first time that the room had changed, not in sound, not in movement, but in awareness. A few nearby tables had gone quieter, not obviously listening, but sensing something different in the air, something that was no longer just another interaction between a customer and a server. And when he looked back at her, Emily had not moved, had not reacted to the attention. She remained exactly where she was, as if the rest of the room did not exist, as if this moment belonged entirely to the space between them. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore felt something unfamiliar, not loss, not yet, but the awareness that he was no longer dictating the outcome, that whatever came next would not be something he could simply dismiss, or outmaneuver. And that realization did not make him angry, it made him still. Daniel Whitmore held her gaze a second longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to crack, something to give him back the upper hand he had always relied on. But Emily Carter did not shift, did not soften, did not retreat, and the stillness between them grew heavier, more defined, until it was no longer empty space but something structured, something deliberate, and Daniel felt it press against him in a way he could not ignore. He leaned back again, slower this time, his hand brushing against the edge of the receipt still resting on the table. That single sense staring back at him like a quiet accusation he had not intended to create. And for a brief moment, his eyes lingered on it, not with pride, not anymore, but with something closer to reconsideration. "You are very composed," he said, the words measured, not quite a compliment, not quite a critique, and Emily gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without accepting it as praise. "It helps," she replied simply, and there was something in that answer that carried weight beyond the words themselves, something practiced, something learned, and Daniel noticed it, the way her tone suggested experience, rather than personality, as if this calm had been built, not given, and that realization shifted his focus again, away from control, toward curiosity. "Most people would not handle this the way you are," he continued, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful, and Emily's eyes did not leave his. "Most people are not used to being tested," she said, and the word returned, sharper this time, more precise, because now it was no longer just a description, it was a mirror, and Daniel felt it land. Not loudly, but clearly. He exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing lightly against the table once more, grounding himself as the conversation moved further from the script he had unconsciously followed for years. "You assume a lot," he said, but there was less conviction in it than before, less certainty, and Emily tilted her head slightly, not dismissing, not challenging, just observing. "No," she answered, "I listen," and that was it. No elaboration, no defense, just a quiet statement that somehow carried more authority than anything else she had said. And Daniel found himself pausing again, longer this time, because listening was not something he associated with power, not in the way he had built his world. Listening was passive, secondary, something done by those who needed to adapt. But standing here, looking at her, he realized that she was not adapting to him at all. She was allowing him to reveal himself, piece by piece, without ever asking him to. And that realization settled into something deeper, something he could not dismiss with a simple remark or a clever response. He glanced around the room again, more aware now of the subtle attention that had gathered, the quiet shift in energy that followed moments like this. And when his eyes returned to Emily, there was a change, small but undeniable. The edge in his posture had softened, not into weakness, but into something closer to awareness. "Tell me something," he said, his voice lower, steadier, no longer testing but searching. "If you already know how this works, why stay quiet at all?" And for the first time, Emily's expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for him. A slight pause, a fraction of a second where her eyes held something deeper than calm, something closer to decision. And when she spoke, her voice remained even, but the weight behind it had changed. "Because people reveal more when they think they are in control," she said, and the sentence settled into the space between them like a quiet truth that did not need to be defended. And Daniel felt it fully this time, not as a challenge, not as an insult, but as a realization that he had walked directly into something he had not recognized until now. And for the first time that evening, he did not immediately respond, because he understood, at least in part, that whatever came next would not be about proving anything at all. Daniel Whitmore did not speak right away, and this time it was not strategy, not calculation, it was something closer to interruption, as if a thought he had not invited had stepped into the room and refused to leave. He looked at her, really looked this time, not as a subject, not as a variable, but as a person standing in front of him without any intention of playing along. And that difference settled into him with an unfamiliar weight, the kind that did not demand reaction, only recognition. His fingers moved again, lightly brushing the receipt, and without fully realizing why, he turned it slightly, as if changing its position might change what it meant, but it did not. The 1 cent remained, quiet, deliberate, and suddenly far louder than it had been before. "You think people like me do not notice that," he said finally, his voice lower, stripped of the earlier edge, "that we are being watched, measured." And Emily's expression did not change, but there was something in her eyes now, not softer, but clearer, as if the conversation had finally reached the place it had been moving toward all along. "I think people notice when it matters," she said, and the simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss, because it did not accuse, it did not explain, it only pointed. And Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back once more, but this time the movement carried less control, less certainty, as if he was no longer positioning himself above the moment, but inside it. "And when does it matter?" he asked, quieter now, not testing, not challenging, just asking. And Emily paused, not for effect, but because the answer did not need to be rushed. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same calm certainty that had followed every word she had said so far. "When someone forgets that the person in front of them is not part of the role they are playing," she said, and for a brief second, something shifted across Daniel's face, subtle, controlled, but real, because that sentence did not just describe behavior. It exposed distance, the space between how he saw people and who they actually were, and he felt it, not as an attack, but as a realization that he had not been looking at her at all. Not really. He had been looking at the position, the uniform, the role, and in doing so, he had missed the person entirely. The room around them continued as if nothing had changed, glasses clinking, conversations flowing. But for Daniel, the noise felt further away now, less immediate, as if the focus had narrowed to a single point, a single moment that he could not step out of. "And what happens when they remember?" he asked, his voice almost quiet enough to disappear into the background. And Emily held his gaze for a second longer before answering. Not quickly, not dramatically, just precisely. "That depends on whether they are willing to see it," she said. And then she reached for the receipt, her movement smooth, unhurried, and placed it back on the table in front of him, exactly where it had been before, the 1 cent still there, unchanged, but somehow heavier now, carrying more meaning than he had ever intended. And Daniel looked down at it, really looked this time, not as a gesture, not as a test, but as a reflection of something he could no longer ignore. And when he looked back up, Emily had not moved, had not shifted her posture or her expression. She simply stood there, calm, present, and for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore understood that whatever came next would not be about control at all. It would be about whether he chose to respond differently than he always had. And that realization stayed with him, quiet, but undeniable. Daniel Whitmore did not reach for the receipt again, not immediately. His eyes lingered on it as if it had become something more than paper and ink, something that reflected back a version of himself he had never needed to examine before. And for a long second, he said nothing, the silence stretching not with tension, but with weight, the kind that settles when something real finally lands. And across from him, Emily Carter remained still, not waiting, not expecting, simply present in a way that did not demand a response. And that presence, quiet and unshaken, made it impossible for him to return to the version of himself that had signed that 1 cent without thought. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders shifting just slightly, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in awareness. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, not dramatically, but enough that it no longer carried the edge of control. "You could have said something earlier," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization forming in real time. And Emily's gaze did not waver. "I did," she replied softly, and the simplicity of the answer held more truth than explanation ever could, because she had, in every pause, in every measured response, in every moment she chose not to react the way he expected, she had been saying something all along, just not in a language he was used to listening to. Daniel nodded once, almost to himself, as if acknowledging something he could not argue with, and his hand finally moved, not to dismiss the receipt, not to push it aside, but to pick it up again, slowly this time, his fingers holding it with a kind of attention it had not received before. He looked at the number, that single cent, and for the first time, it did not feel clever, it did not feel controlled, it felt small, and that realization settled into him with a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken out loud. He placed the receipt back down, but differently this time, not slid carelessly to the edge, but set flat, aligned, as if acknowledging its place in the moment. "What would you have done?" he asked, his voice steady. "If I never noticed?" And Emily took a breath, not because the question was difficult, but because it deserved a clear answer. "Nothing different," she said. And when he looked up, her expression had not changed, still calm, still grounded. "Not everything is meant to be corrected out loud," she continued, her tone even. "Sometimes it is just meant to be seen." And Daniel held her gaze as the meaning settled in, because that was the part he had missed all along. This was never about changing him in the moment, never about forcing a reaction or winning a point. It was about allowing him to see himself clearly enough to choose something else. And that realization carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. He leaned back slowly, his posture no longer rigid, no longer calculated, but thoughtful, as if the space around him had expanded beyond the table, beyond the room, into something quieter, something more internal. And for the first time that evening, he did not feel the need to fill the silence. He let it exist, let it settle. And when he finally looked back at Emily, there was something different in his expression, not submission, not even apology yet, but awareness, clear and undeniable, the kind that changes what comes next whether it is spoken or not. And as she turned to step away, not abruptly, not dramatically, just naturally, as if her part in the moment was complete, Daniel did not stop her, did not call her back, because for the first time, he understood that control was never the point, and that what mattered now was not what he said next, but what he chose to do after she was gone. Emily Carter did not look back as she walked away, her steps steady, unhurried, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of the restaurant, as if nothing unusual had just taken place, as if the moment that had shifted something fundamental in the air had belonged only to him. And Daniel Whitmore remained seated, his gaze following her for a brief second before dropping back to the table, to the receipt, to the quiet evidence of a version of himself he could no longer pretend not to see, the noise of. The room returned slowly, conversations rising and falling, silverware clinking against plates, but it all felt distant now, like sound filtered through a layer he had not noticed before. He sat there without reaching for his phone, without signaling for service, without doing any of the things that usually filled the spaces between decisions, because for once, there was no decision to make, only something to understand. His hand moved again, almost instinctively, and he picked up the pen he had used earlier, turning it between his fingers as if measuring its weight, as if considering what it meant to use it differently. And after a moment, he pulled the receipt closer, not with the same careless motion as before, but with intention, and he looked at it one last time. The 1 cent no longer a clever test, no longer a symbol of control, but a quiet reminder of how easily power could distort perception. And slowly, deliberately, he flipped it over, the blank side facing up, clean, untouched, and he paused, not because he did not know what to do, but because this time, it mattered how he did it. The pen hovered for a second before it touched the paper, and when he wrote, the movement was steady, controlled, but different, not a signature meant to assert identity, not a number meant to provoke reaction, but a simple line, clear and unembellished, something meant to be read, not interpreted, He set the pen down beside it, his fingers releasing it without hesitation, and then he sat back, not waiting for her to return, not expecting acknowledgement, just allowing the action to exist on its own, the way her silence had. A few minutes passed, or maybe longer. He did not check, did not track the time the way he usually did, because for once, the outcome was not something he needed to control. And when Emily eventually approached the table again, her steps just as calm as before, her expression unchanged, Daniel did not look up immediately, not out of avoidance, but out of something closer to respect for the moment itself. And when he did meet her eyes, there was no edge left, no test hidden beneath the surface, just clarity, quiet and unforced. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried a weight they had not carried before, not as a formality, not as a transaction, but as recognition, and Emily's gaze held his for a brief second, long enough to acknowledge the shift, long enough to understand that something had changed, not in the room, not in the situation, but in him, and she gave a small nod, not approving, not surprised, just accepting, as if this was always a possibility, as if the outcome had never been about her at all. She reached for the receipt, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the paper, and for a moment, her eyes flicked down to what he had written, just long enough to see, just long enough to understand, and then she looked back up, her expression still composed, still grounded, but with a quiet acknowledgement that did not need words, and without saying anything else, she turned and stepped away again, leaving Daniel alone at the table, but not in the same way as before, because this time, the silence did not feel like absence, it felt like something complete. Daniel Whitmore remained seated long after Emily Carter disappeared into the quiet rhythm of the restaurant, his eyes no longer scanning the room, no longer calculating the next move, but resting instead on the space she had left behind, as if something invisible still lingered there, something that did not belong to the place but to the moment itself. He reached for the glass of water in front of him, not out of habit, but as if grounding himself in something simple, something real, and took a slow sip, the coolness steady, unremarkable, and yet different somehow, as if even the smallest actions carried more awareness now. He set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table without thinking, a subtle shift in behavior that would have gone unnoticed before, and his gaze drifted once more to the receipt, now gone from the table, but not from his mind. The words he had written replaying quietly, not for validation, not for approval, but as a reflection of a choice he had made without pressure, without performance, just because it felt necessary. And that was unfamiliar territory, a decision not driven by outcome, not measured by return, but simply because it aligned with something he had only just begun to recognize. Across the room, he noticed Emily again, not directly, but in motion, her presence blending into the flow of service, her posture unchanged, her pace steady, as if nothing about her had shifted at all, and perhaps it had not. Perhaps the only thing that had changed was the way he saw it, the way he interpreted the quiet confidence that had always been there, unnoticed, unacknowledged. Until now, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his shoulders relaxing in a way that was not calculated, not intentional, but natural, and for the first time that evening, he allowed himself to simply observe without interference, without expectation, watching the way she interacted with other tables, the consistency in her tone, the absence of unnecessary words, the subtle control in her timing, and it became clear, slowly, that what he had mistaken for silence earlier was never emptiness. It was precision, it was choice, it was the ability to engage only when it mattered. And that realization settled deeper than anything she had said directly, because it revealed something he had overlooked not just in her, but in others, in the countless interactions he had reduced to transactions, to outcomes, to roles. And as the minutes passed, he felt no urgency to leave, no pull toward the next meeting, the next call, the next decision waiting outside those walls, because for once, the moment in front of him was enough, complete in a way that did not require expansion. He checked his watch out of instinct, the polished face catching the warm light. But instead of calculating time, he simply noted it, then lowered his wrist again, letting it rest, the numbers no longer dictating the pace of his thoughts. And when he finally stood, The movement was unhurried, deliberate, his chair sliding back with a soft sound that barely interrupted the room. He adjusted his jacket, not out of habit, but out of awareness, and as he turned toward the exit, his gaze passed over Emily one last time, not lingering, not demanding attention, just acknowledging. And she did not look up, did not need to, because whatever had passed between them had already reached its conclusion, not in words, not in gestures, but in understanding. And as Daniel stepped toward the door, the noise of the restaurant continued behind him, unchanged, uninterrupted, but he carried something different with him now, something quieter than power, something steadier than control, the simple awareness that not every moment needed to be owned to matter. And that realization stayed with him as he walked out into the cool night air, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead, no longer something to dominate, but something to move through, one step at a time. The night air outside was cool, steady, untouched by the quiet shift that had just taken place inside, and Daniel Whitmore paused for a moment just beyond the restaurant doors, not because he needed to, but because something in him was no longer moving at the same speed as before. The city stretched out in front of him, headlights passing, distant conversations blending into the rhythm of late evening. But for once, none of it demanded his attention, none of it pulled him forward. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets, his posture relaxed in a way that did not feel rehearsed, and for the first time in years, there was no immediate destination pressing against his thoughts, no next step already forming before the current one had finished. He simply stood there, aware, present, and that alone felt unfamiliar. Back inside, Emily Carter continued her shift without pause, her movements as precise as they had always been, her tone unchanged, her presence steady among the quiet flow of service. And when she reached the station near the counter, she set the receipt down beside the register, not with ceremony, not with hesitation, just as part of the rhythm. But for a brief second, her eyes rested on it, on the line written in careful, deliberate ink, and though her expression did not change, there was a subtle acknowledgement in the stillness of that moment. Not surprise, not validation, just recognition, the kind that does not need to be shared. A coworker passed by, asking a routine question, and Emily responded as she always did, calm, efficient, without drawing attention to anything beyond the task at hand, because for her, nothing had changed, and yet everything had been revealed, not through action, not through confrontation, but through the simple act of allowing someone to see clearly when they were ready. Outside, Daniel finally began to walk, his steps measured, not rushed, his gaze no longer scanning for opportunity, but taking in what was already there, the quiet glow of streetlights, the reflection of glass against the night sky, the presence of people moving through their own moments without awareness of his. And for once, that felt right. Not something to control, not something to influence, just something to move through. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, a familiar interruption, a reminder of the world that had always followed him. But he did not reach for it immediately. He let it ring out, the vibration fading on its own, because whatever waited on the other side of that call could wait a little longer, and that choice, small as it was, carried more weight than it should have. Back inside, Emily picked up the receipt once more, folding it neatly before placing it into the drawer, her movements unchanged, her rhythm uninterrupted. But the line written there would remain, not as something she needed to revisit, but as something already understood. And as the night continued, tables turning, conversations shifting, the restaurant returned fully to its ordinary pace, untouched on the surface, but carrying within it a moment that had quietly redefined itself. Not for everyone, not even for most, but for one person who had walked in expecting control and left with something far more lasting. And as Daniel Whitmore disappeared into the flow of the city, there was no dramatic change, no visible transformation, just a subtle shift in the way he moved, the way he observed, the way he chose, and sometimes that is all it